A quiet tale of love lost and healing. She discovers strength in heartbreak, learns to let go, and finally finds peace by looking up to the moon that never stopped shining above her darkest nights. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, alive with movement, voices, and lights that blurred behind the rainy veil of the apartment window. From her seat on the edge of the couch, she stared through the misted glass, her fingers absently tracing an outline of a half-remembered face, drawn from memory and aching regret. The warmth that once saturated the space had long since evaporated, replaced by an empty hush that filled every corner. Silence, no longer unfamiliar, wrapped around her like an old, tattered shawl. There had been a time when she had believed love to be a constant, something unmoving like a star fixed in the night sky. It had offered a sense of promise, of permanence, and she had leaned into it, foolishly trusting its unwavering strength. But promises dissolved and constellations faded. The universe she now knew rearranged its course without notice, and hearts, no matter how tightly guarded, could crack wide open. That revelation had begun not with a shout or a storm, but with a sky void of stars. The night had been unusually quiet, the city lights subdued as if anticipating something unspoken. That was the night he arrived unexpectedly, unassumingly, yet strangely magnetically. His presence didn't announce itself, but it settled into her world with the quiet conviction of something inevitable. At first, she watched from afar, careful to maintain distance, unsure whether to trust what stirred beneath her chest. But time, persistent and patient, closed the distance. A glance became a shared smile. Familiarity wove itself into routine, and suddenly the spaces in her life that once echoed with solitude were filled with him. Their world became a mosaic of stolen hours, quiet mornings, and shared silences. They never needed grandeur. A walk through late-night streets, fingers brushing in passing. A warm drink shared in winter, his hand reaching for hers when she least expected it. These small, quiet moments became their language, their tether to something that felt like truth. Her heart had whispered that it was enough, more than enough. Yet love has its shadows. She remembered the moment when unease first stirred, not as thunder, but as a faint hum beneath the surface. A message glanced at too quickly, a name that lingered like smoke in the back of her mind. The kind of detail that wouldn't matter if her heart hadn't already begun to suspect. Still, she pushed the thoughts away, stacking denial like bricks in a wall that she hoped could hold everything together. But the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. It seeps through the cracks, showing itself in the way someone avoids eye contact, in the weight of silence where laughter used to be. She felt it in how his phone now lived face down on the table, how his words lost their color, how he began to exist more in his absence than in his presence. There were no confessions, no names exchanged, only a growing awareness that she had been living in someone else's story. Even then, she had held on, to hope, to possibility, to the idea that love could be reclaimed with effort. But some endings are not dramatic. They are quiet, inevitable, like the tide slipping away from the shore. She had written a letter, not with anger but with finality, and left it on the counter, the ink still damp with something between sorrow and acceptance. She hadn't needed to stay to hear his response. The silence spoke louder than any word could. She remembered the feeling of the cold air biting her cheeks as she stepped into the night, her footsteps echoing down empty streets. The city had not changed. It still hummed with late traffic, flickering signs and the rustle of wind through narrow alleys, but she had. Her heart was heavier, her eyes sharper. There was no one to chase her down, no hand to reach for hers in protest. She walked not away from something but toward the truth she had long refused to face. She had not been the only one. There had been another, a woman whose name she did not know, whose life had been stitched into his long before she entered the picture. Perhaps she had suspected, or perhaps she had been untouched by betrayal. Either way, she had been the one whose place was never questioned, whose name was never left unspoken. And it had not been a matter of choosing between them. The choice had already been made. The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of motion. She kept herself busy, filled her days with work, and submerged herself in the predictability of deadlines and morning commutes. Books became her companions in the evening, their words a shelter from the emptiness that still clung to the corners of her apartment. She rearranged the furniture, removed old photographs, lit candles not for ambience but to remind herself that light still existed. Healing was not linear. Some mornings she woke with a heaviness she couldn't explain, a lingering ache that curled in her chest before she'd even left the bed. Other days were clearer, calmer, filled with moments where she almost forgot. Almost. But the memory always returned, sometimes triggered by a scent in the air or the rustle of a coat that looked too familiar in a crowded train. She learned to let the feeling pass, like a storm that came without warning. Then, without warning, she saw him. It was early evening, the light just beginning to dim. She had been walking home, umbrella in hand, the streets slick with rain and traffic slow-moving around her. Across the intersection, standing beneath the soft glow of a street lamp, was a figure she knew before her mind could fully process it. His posture, the slight tilt of his shoulders, the quiet way he stood, it was him. The years had not changed him much, though his eyes seemed more distant, less open. She stopped, frozen in place. There was a space between them now more than physical, shaped by time and everything unsaid. For a moment, she wondered if he would sense her gaze, if some invisible string might still pull his attention to where she stood. But he never looked. He simply stood there for a few more seconds, then turned, disappearing into the crowd as if he had never been there. She did not cry. Instead, she walked the rest of the way home with slow, steady steps. That night, as she sat again by the same window that had once felt like a cage, she looked up. The clouds had cleared. The moon hung bright and unbothered above the city skyline. It had been there the whole time, unchanged and constant, waiting to be seen again. And for the first time in months, she truly saw it. The following morning arrived quietly, as if the world itself had softened. The air was cool, and the light that filtered through the curtains had a gentler hue. She rose slowly, unhurried, the floor cold beneath her feet but familiar. The small rituals of her morning unfolded with calm deliberation. Boiling water, the soft clink of a mug, the scent of brewed tea warming the apartment's stillness. She no longer reached for her phone as soon as she woke. The impulse had faded, replaced by something quieter, a desire not for connection but for presence. She began keeping a journal, not to chronicle loss but to reclaim her voice. Her words, once tangled in memories of him, now traced the edges of who she was becoming. There was freedom in that slow, fragile, but real. Outside, the city moved as it always had, unaware of the private seasons people carried inside them. She no longer tried to keep pace with its relentless rhythm. Instead, she allowed herself the luxury of stillness. A walk through the park without purpose. An afternoon spent in the corner of a quiet cafe. She watched the world not as someone looking to forget, but as someone learning how to see again. There were days when her memories of him returned, uninvited but no longer unwelcome. They came less like storms and more like shadows, gentle outlines of what had once been. She let them pass through her. She did not flinch at the sound of a laugh that resembled his or a song they once played during quiet dinners. They had become part of her story, not her ending. The woman he had returned to remained faceless. She remained imagined only in brief flashes. In the past, jealousy had painted her in cruel, competitive colors, but that too had faded. Now, when she thought of her, it was with unexpected tenderness. They had both loved the same man, perhaps at different times, perhaps in overlapping truths. That alone had made them both human. In the months that followed, she learned how to fill the silences. She explored places they had never visited together. Bookstores tucked between alleys, weekend markets bursting with noise and scent, and new corners of the city she had never given herself time to notice. She started planting herbs on her balcony. Each sprout became a small affirmation. Life could begin again, even from what had once withered. At night, she often found herself on the balcony, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the hum of the world below. Lights flickered on and off in the buildings across from hers, each window a story unfolding. She no longer wondered where he was or who he was with. That chapter had closed not with bitterness, but with understanding. There were no grand revelations, no sudden moment when everything healed. Instead, there were small triumphs. The first time she laughed and didn't feel guilty. The first night she slept through without dreaming. The first time she looked at a couple holding hands and didn't ache with absence. These moments arrived quietly and stayed, forming a new rhythm within her. Seasons changed. The air grew warmer, the days longer. Her wardrobe shifted from layers of winter grays to lighter fabrics and softer colors. One morning, as she walked past a flower shop, she paused. Without thinking, she bought a single stem of white freesia. She brought it home and placed it in a glass jar by the window. It stood there delicate and alive, catching the sunlight in its petals. Time, once a burden, became a companion. She marked its passage not by distance from him, but by how close she was to herself. Old photographs remained in their drawer, but she no longer avoided them. They told a story, a true one, even if it didn't last. She did not erase those memories. They were part of her, like the scar beneath her left knee or the birthmark on her shoulder. Evidence that she had lived, loved, lost. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, she imagined what might have been. Not with regret, but with curiosity. She pictured a version of her life where he had stayed, where things had been different. But she never lingered long in those thoughts. She had learned that longing for what could have been kept her from embracing what was still possible. She began to write again, not in her journal, but in the way she once dreamed of as a craft, an offering. Short stories formed, then longer pieces. Her pain had once silenced her, but now it gave her depth, clarity. Her words found readers, strangers who connected with the emotions she had once believed were hers alone. Through them, she discovered a new kind of closeness, built not on promises but on shared truths. One afternoon, while walking by the river, she found herself smiling at the sky. It wasn't a moment marked by anything special, just the wind brushing through the trees, the water catching sunlight in 1,000 sparkles, and the faint murmur of the city nearby. And in that simplicity, there was peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of forgiving. Him, herself, everything in between. Years passed, not all at once, but steadily. She moved to a new apartment, this one brighter with tall windows and creaking floors. She brought her plants, her books, her words. The white freesia had long since faded, but she kept its jar as a reminder. Even delicate things could leave lasting impressions. The past did not disappear. It lived in her gently now, like a song that no longer hurt to hear. She didn't avoid the bakery they once loved. She no longer paused at street corners with the hope of seeing his face in the crowd. Her memories of him had softened, turned warm at the edges. He had once been part of her world, and that had meant something. And that was enough. On her birthday, she spent the day alone by choice. She cooked her favorite meal, played music she loved, and lit a candle just for herself. That evening, as she stood by the window, the moon hung high above the skyline, full and luminous. She raised her glass in quiet acknowledgement not to the past, not even to the future, but to the woman she had become. She no longer needed the world to witness her healing. She had lived through silence, through heartbreak, through the quiet reconstruction of a life she once thought ended. And in doing so, she had discovered a resilience she never knew she had. A strength not built on denial or distraction, but on truth, raw, honest, and enduring. Perhaps love was not always meant to last in the way stories promised. Perhaps its purpose was to teach, to shape, to lead us back to ourselves. She no longer searched for meaning in every loss. She had stopped asking why. She had learned, instead, to ask, what now? And that made all the difference. As the city lights flickered and the stars returned to their rightful place in the sky, she breathed in the cool night air and let it fill her. A quiet smile touched her lips. The moon had never stopped shining. She had just remembered to look up,